First of all, a massive thank you to everyone that has been listening to the podcast and sending me lovely messages about it. However, I know from the analytics that we also have a ton of secret listeners. So if you're a secret listener, my request to you is as follows. If you enjoy this episode, share it on LinkedIn or on Instagram and tag me. I would absolutely love to hear from you, and all feedback is always welcomed. On today's episode of Stamp Your Mark, I'll be speaking to Josh Graff, the Managing Director of LinkedIn in EMEA and Latin America. Josh has worked at LinkedIn for over 11 years and has played a crucial role in the transition of the platform from a static site where you upload your CV to the social media powerhouse that it is today. This has got to be one of my favorite episodes so far. You're going to absolutely love it. So introducing Josh Graff.
When I joined, we were 80 million members. Today we're over 800.
Wow.
When I joined, we were 800 employees. Today we're over 17,000. When I joined, it was your CV and a job searching site. Today we're the largest distributor of professional content on the planet. We help 6 people a minute find a job. There are 200 million job applications every month. It's growing at some of the fastest rates that we've seen in our history.
Josh Graff, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thank you so much for making the time to be on the
Pleasure.
podcast.
Thanks for the invite.
So I would love to kick off by asking about your career experience today. How did you get to become the Managing Director of LinkedIn in Europe, Middle East, Asia, and then Latin America?
So my career, if I wind the clock back, when I was younger, I was desperate to work. Like from the age of 8, 9, 10, probably an inappropriate time for a kid to be working, but I was always desperate to do work experience wherever I could get it. Packing boxes in a factory. My aunt worked on a magazine at the time, so I was like taking clothes around Soho at the age of 12, also probably not that appropriate in hindsight, but I was always desperate to work, and I enjoyed, in fact, I could study, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And then I took the standard path. Well, I took a year out, and then I went to university, which was a path that I felt I was expected to go down. And after a year and a quarter, I realized that it wasn't for me. So complicated time in my life, but I decided to drop out of university. My parents were unbelievably accepting, wow. But they were very clear that they didn't go to university either. They started their own business 50 years ago and ran it together every day. And they were very clear with me, which is, we understand you're dropping out of university, but you've got 6 weeks and then you need to find yourself a job. And whatever that job is, I could go work in Pizza Express or McDonald's. I just have to get out the house and go get a job. And considering I was always so desperate to work, that came pretty naturally to me. And I was very lucky. I managed to get some work experience in an events company, working on events like London Fashion Week at the time, which was super exciting for me. But again, I was just running around town, delivering things to people. And about 4 months later, I managed to secure myself a job at Transworld International, which was the TV arm of IMG, the International Management Group. And it was a .com company. It was called Network of the World at the time. And I joined as a researcher on a television program that was being streamed online. But at the time, broadband wasn't particularly great. And therefore, it was a bit of a clunky member experience. But nevertheless, I did it for a couple of years. I loved every minute of it. I loved working. Frankly, I loved getting a paycheck for the first time in my life. I liked the variety. I liked the breadth. And then one day I was working on a show about video games, and I knew not much about video games. I've got like 2 left thumbs. I never really enjoyed playing video games when I was a kid. And I was researching on a show about video games, and the producer asked me to go and find someone to interview about product placement in video games. So I started looking around, and I really struggled. And I found one person, in fact, her name was Julie Schumacher. She worked at Electronic Arts, EA Games. She was in California at the time, but she was the only person in the world that I could find who did advertising in video games. And I'd seen a couple of pieces of data in the months preceding that. And something struck me. I was like, there's a lot of advertisers looking to reach, at the time, 18 to 35-year-old men. And 18 to 35-year-old men I knew were watching less television because we were working in TV at the time, so I had all these stats. And then on the flip side, I saw the rise of video games and the fact that there were so many 18 to 35-year-old men going towards video games. So I was like, there's only one person in the world doing advertising in video games. There's lots of people watching them. There's lots of advertisers and marketers struggling to reach this audience. There's got to be something in this. And in hindsight, a lot of naivety, but I think the naivety was probably very helpful in hindsight because I'm not sure I would have done the same today. I quit 2 weeks later and I started an agency doing advertising in video games.
Wow, brilliant. So before we go further along the journey, it sounds like you were pretty kind of obsessed with getting a job and making money from a really young age. Yeah. Where do you think that drive came from?
It's a good question. I've often thought about it, and I suspect two things. I'm not very good with free time. So I am pretty fidgety and I always need to be active. I always need a task. I'm terrible at relaxing. Like my husband will, he's pretty good at it and I'm pretty atrocious at it. But it seems to work between us. So one thing is I'm not very good at relaxing. The other thing is I was brought up with parents who started a business immediately after they got married. They started a children's clothing business from scratch, and they ended up designing and distributing children's clothes around the world. And they ran a small business every day for 50 years. And when I was growing up, I was surrounded by conversation around what it's like to run a small business, the highs, the lows, the upsides, the downsides. And I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by business. I was fascinated from speaking to my parents' friends who were in business as well. And I always was more interested in that than I was at school. And when I was at school, although I enjoyed parts of it, I never felt like it was particularly applicable or I couldn't apply it to a job, and I really struggled with that concept. So I think the fact that I was like not great with free time, I liked making money, frankly, and I was surrounded by parents who were very entrepreneurial. So probably a combination of those factors.
What did you spend your first paycheck on? Do you remember?
My first paycheck. I don't remember what I spent my first paycheck on. I remember moving into my first flat and in a very, very childish way, I thought to myself, I've got my own money. I can go buy my own chocolates and sweets. I'm an adult now. I'm an adult. And I don't need permission. I mean, I was like 22, 23 at the time. So clearly I hadn't had to have permission for like 14, 15 years to buy candy. But I remember going and buying it and putting it in my own fridge and thinking to myself, this is my own fridge. And that was pretty exciting.
Do any particular moments stand out in the younger days of you working that you can share? Any funny moments, any big learnings, any anecdotes?
I mean, you know, you're an entrepreneur. It's not an easy ride. And when I started my company, I was sending out hundreds and hundreds of emails every day, pitch emails, and 999 in 1,000, you either wouldn't get a response or it would be a no. And then you sort of desperately hope for that one, and then the one finally comes, and then that gives you energy to go through the next phase. But when I was much younger, I remember, my aunt would probably kill me for saying this, but at the time she was the editor of She magazine. And I was going in and doing work experience when I was 12, 13. And at the time it was called dumping copy. People used to send in articles which were on a typewriter or handwritten. So they needed someone in the office to be able to type them and put them into the computer. And I was doing this at 12 or 13. And slightly strangely, I taught myself to type at the age of 10 or 11. Again, I wasn't very good with free time. And at 11 or 12, I found myself, and I was like typing out all of these articles, but I was typing out articles about like women's sex lives at the time, because that was some of the content that was going into She magazine. And I just remember coming home and like my parents were like, what did you do today? And I was starting to tell them about not just the process, but the content. And they were pretty amused that a 12, 13-year-old kid was going and like writing about women's or typing about women's sex lives.
That's brilliant. I remember I had a job in a garden centre when I was 12. It was my first ever job. And the bosses would take the piss, but I just didn't realise at the time. So they would send me to the newsagents to pick up striped paint.
Yeah.
And so I would go to newsagents and go to the paint shop, and they would just say, no, sorry, we don't have any striped paint in today. And I have to walk all the way back. And I didn't learn from it. The next time it was, can you go pick up some broken eggs? So I would walk all the way to the newsagents, ask for some broken eggs, and they'd say, no, I mean, you can break them yourselves, but we don't actually sell broken eggs. And I'd go all the way back. But it's funny to look back on things like that. And so you started your business.
Yeah.
What was that journey like for you?
It was, again, in hindsight, I was wonderfully naive, and I think that was an enormous benefit. Mm-hmm. I really struggled at first. Well, at first you're amazingly, you're amazingly energized, and then it gets a point 3-6 months later where there's not really any business coming in, and then you become despondent, and then you get your first win, and that gives you this amazing next wave of energy. But I remember setting up the website. I mean, I built the website myself because I couldn't afford to pay for anyone to do it. So I built the website myself, and I set up a load of email addresses like press@jaminternational.com, sales@jaminternational.com, my EA who had a name at jaminternational.com, and clearly everything came into my inbox, and then I responded on behalf of several people. But it was, people often ask me if I regret it, and I don't regret any part of it at all. I didn't enjoy every minute of it, but I learned a load, and I think it taught me a load of skills like intellectual curiosity, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, resilience, the importance of passion and energy, the importance of not taking yourself too seriously in business. And I think all of those skills have been incredibly helpful for me in my career since that point.
Mm-hmm. And so you ended up selling the business, which seems like a really magical thing, right? That's the point that a lot of entrepreneurs look towards. That's their kind of personal North Star, even though they won't typically broadcast that.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
What happened is I was running the business, and I saw a press release from a company in New York called Massive Incorporated. Mm-hmm. And the company in New York, I was putting advertising in video games, but I was hard coding it in the same way that you would do film product placement. And the benefit of that is it could be deeply embedded into the game experience. The downside of it is that you had to get there 2 years in advance as the game was being developed. And so it was a very long, quite complex process. The press release from the company in New York had created a sort of ad serving technology that enabled you to serve ads in real time, which in 2002 wasn't the norm. And so you could put billboards into football games like Pro Evolution Soccer, for example. And I remember reading the press release about something they'd done. I don't remember explicitly what it was. And at the end of the press release, Mitch, their CEO, said, and we look forward to opening our office soon in Europe. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I emailed him that afternoon, introduced myself, had no real idea what I was emailing him about. I just knew that they were doing something interesting. I knew they didn't have a presence in Europe. I thought there may be potentially some opportunity for us to do something together, but I didn't know the specifics. I explained what I'd been doing, and we'd had a couple of wins under our belt as well. And so I didn't think I'd get a response. 20 minutes later, he responded saying, I've read about what you've been up to. I'd love you to come to New York next week to discuss what we can do together. My assistant will be in touch. I was like, great. Free ticket to go see my sister who lives in New York. So I was like, tick, that was definitely a bonus. And 48 hours later, I was in New York, and I ended up spending, Massive was a startup at the time. They had about 60, 70 people. I ended up spending 3 days in that office, meeting a load of people. And at the end of the third day, I sat down with Mitch, and he made me an offer to acquire my company, the expertise, and in return for me to go back to Europe and establish their European and Asia Pacific operations for Massive.
Wow. And how big was your company at the time?
There were 3 of us.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of IP or just general expertise?
No, there was expertise. There was no IP. It was purely sort of industry knowledge, relationships with games companies, relationships with marketers, and feet on the ground of someone who was like eager to learn and was going to work super hard.
Yeah. And where were you when the actual offer was made? Was this in a classic boardroom setting? Did he slide a piece of paper across the table?
I think I was sitting in his, I've never thought about that. I think I was sitting in his office and I was pretty surprised, but I think at the time I must have just said like, thanks, let me consider it, and sort of, I'll fly back to London and let you know. And I flew back to London and I got in touch with him the next day. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. And I was enthusiastic about their technology. I was enthusiastic about what that technology could do for advertising and video games. I'd got to a stage where, actually by this stage I was doing, sorry, I should go back on what I said before. I was working with a couple of other people, but we broke off and I was doing it by myself at this stage. And although I was enjoying it, it was a pretty lonely experience. And this was a real opportunity for me to start working with a load of very, very smart people, technologists, marketers, sales professionals from whom I could learn and develop.
That's brilliant. And then, so you sold the business and you continued working there. And then a year later, that business was acquired by Microsoft.
Yeah, May 2006, Massive Incorporated got sold to MSN at the time.
Okay. And what was that process like?
There was a lot of... the only part of it that I really remember was very late night due diligence. I remember being awake at 3 or 4 in the morning speaking to my colleagues in the US as Microsoft was doing due diligence on Massive, going through all of our contracts. And it was exhausting, but incredibly energizing. I was like 24, 25 at the time or something. And we then got brought into MSM. I had a couple of roles there. One of my roles was to educate the MSN sales team on how to sell advertising and video games across Europe. And the second role was to continue to partner with video games publishers to ensure that we had the inventory and that we could integrate our SDK, our software development kit, into their game engine so that we could effectively serve ads. And I did that for a year. And Mitch, the CEO of the company that acquired my company, had subsequently left and set up a new business. And I spoke to him and he made me an offer to go join that business. And I went and joined that business. And frankly, it wasn't a great experience. I mean, I adore Mitch. He was a fabulous leader, but the business that they were in, which was making video games based off movie IP, I quickly realized wasn't a business that I wanted to be in. I ended up being there for about a year. Culturally, I found it quite difficult. But I learned a huge amount along the way. I was doing licensing agreements in Eastern Europe at the time for video games, which I'd never done in my entire life. So that was a whole nother skill that I could add to my portfolio. But I did realize it wasn't for me. And then an opportunity came up through a headhunter to go and work at Electronic Arts, who was one of our clients for many years. So I knew the team there pretty well. At the time, they were the largest games developer in the world, games publisher in the world. And I met my boss, a lady called Elizabeth Haas, who I sort of fell in love with from the interview process. I was like, you're somebody I want to work with, for, in whatever capacity. She had amazing energy, still very close to her today. I thought I could learn a load from her. She'd been working in the advertising business for many years. And she convinced me to join EA. And I joined to start up their in-game advertising and brand partnerships business for Europe at the time.
Brilliant. And so you were there for nearly 3 years.
Yeah.
And then you joined LinkedIn, and that's around 11 years ago.
Yes.
What I find really interesting is that you started a business and then never again.
Yes.
Never started another one. Why is that?
Wow. Why? I always say never. And I'm often asked if I would go back to startup mode. And I don't know if I would. I really like working in a mid to large sized company. I like and thrive off leading teams. Don't get me wrong, like working in a large company, as everyone knows, can also be exhausting and energizing, and you have up days and down days. But I'm not sure I could go back to startup mode. I could go back to a company of like 60 to 100 people that was starting to grow and had a good sort of product, good market fit. But unless I had a fabulous idea, and I don't have any at the moment, I think I would struggle to go back to complete startup. I have crazy admiration for what you've been doing over the last couple of years. It takes immense resilience and confidence and commitment, and I'm not sure that is for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It is definitely horrible at times, and sometimes it's for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah.
But you're so right. On the resilience front, it really, really builds you. You know, if you want to become more resilient, start a business. It's a surefire way to get there. But then also you mentioned the loneliness that you experienced at the time. I thought the loneliness would reduce over time because I'd have more people in my team. You know, there are 16 of us now, but it just doesn't, because the level of problems you need to deal with gets a lot higher. The problems get deeper. And if you're the sole co-founder, or even if you have one co-founder, the real kind of raw conversations that you can have is limited to either yourself or that co-founder, and that's it. And so that loneliness definitely continues. It looks a little bit different. It's kind of loneliness in a different font, but it definitely exists.
It's a nice description, loneliness in a different font. I've always, I'm sure you've got the same, Reid Hoffman said, the founder of LinkedIn, he's always spoken about this concept of a board of advisors, and not a board of advisors in the context of a company board, but as a personal board of advisors. I'm sure you surrounded yourself with a load of great people, and that often, at least in my experience back then, sort of helped soften the loneliness a bit, because you could go and speak to a group of people that you admired, that you trusted, that would give you very candid, genuine, direct, but constructive feedback. And also could be a great sounding board because there's few people to be able to do that with in startup mode. And so I've sort of held on to that advice for many years. And even in the current role, there is a board of advisors that I can go to on a daily basis, depending on the topic, different people for different things. But hopefully that can reduce the loneliness a little. Yeah,
it's definitely true. I think I've missed the mark sometimes by accidentally treating kind of fellow entrepreneurs as like therapists and just giving them all my problems. Each time I'd call them, it'd be like, okay, what is it this time?
Yeah.
But what's then really nice about that is other entrepreneurs would message me, people, you know, regardless of age, people who are earlier on in their business journey.
Yeah.
And then I would find myself giving them similar advice, but with my own kind of personal slant. And it's nice. There's a real community that builds around it. But I like this idea of, you know, the personal board of advisors.
Yeah.
What kind of people do you have on your board?
I mean, there's a vast array of them, and some of them are some of them are current bosses, current peers. Some of them are ex-bosses. Some of them are family friends. Some of them are family members. It's a real variety, and again, it depends on the topic that I want to cover. Is it something where you need deep domain? Some of them are clients. Sometimes if you need deep domain expertise in advertising or marketing or SaaS or marketplaces, like, it's going to be a very different group of folks than if I want to go and have a conversation about a series of very difficult discussions that I need to have with folks at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, brilliant. And so then you started at LinkedIn.
Yes.
I would love to know what LinkedIn was like back then, because from my understanding, we've gone from a job searching platform, you log in purely to try to find a job or to hire somebody, to a real social media powerhouse.
It is very different. I mean, actually, I say that there are a load of similarities when it comes to culture, when it comes to values. They are the foundations that have been, at least in my experience, been there since day one. And they are two of the key reasons why I'm still there today. But if you look at the platform itself, you're absolutely right. It is a world away from what it was. When I joined, we were 80 million members. Today, we're over 800.
Wow.
When I joined, we were 800 employees. Today, we're over 17,000. When I joined, it was your CV and a job searching site. Today, we're the largest distributor of professional content on the planet. We help 6 people a minute find a job. There are 200 million job applications every month. It's growing at some of the fastest rates that we've seen in our history. It was up, public conversations are up 30% in January this year. And the size of the business is also very different. Last year, we hit $10 billion. I don't remember the specific number when we joined, but I suspect it was sub $75 million globally. So it is a very, very different place. It has been a joy and frankly a privilege to be part of that growth over the last 11 years. But again, like if I look back on the reasons that I joined, they're the same reasons that keep me there today. When I joined, people, I met arguably too many. We've improved our recruitment process because I probably met about 12 or 13 people in the interview process for LinkedIn. And normally when you meet that many people, there's like a third who they fall into the category of inspiring, I want to work with, I want to work for in some capacity, I can learn from them. There's a third who you're like, yeah, I'm really happy to sit next to them into the office. And there's a third who you're like, oh yeah, I really hope I don't have to work in like such close proximity to them. And everybody fell into the first category, like very, very clearly into the first category. I was like, this I can get on board with. The second thing was the product. Even though it was relatively basic at the time, I was in a business development role and sales role for many years. And when I reflected on my usage of LinkedIn, even then I found myself using it every day. And I was like, if I'm using it every day, there's something in this. There is real value for the member. And then the third bit was potential, which was infinite at the time. 80 million people. It was growing at triple-digit percentages year over year. And I thought, if it's growing this fast and the revenue is this small, and there's an appetite for people to build their professional networks, to find jobs at scale, like there's got to be something here. So this combination of people, product, and this incredible potential were the 3 things that attracted me in the first place, and certainly the 3 things that keep me here today. And the fourth thing that has become more important to me, and I'd love to say it was with me 11 years ago, but it wasn't, was this idea of purpose. Like the mission and vision of LinkedIn is to connect the world's professionals, make them more productive and more successful, to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. It makes you feel pretty good when you go into work every day with a higher purpose of like delivering great value for people around the world. Yeah.
And was it always part of the plan for LinkedIn to transition from that kind of almost static CV, online CV platform to this huge social media where people are distributing professional content, building their personal brands and so on?
Yes, but I don't think there was clarity on how to get there. Like if you sit down with Reed and with Alan Blue, one of the other co-founders, they are like remarkable people. And I remember Reed telling me one day that they sat down in the early days and they wrote a list of, firstly, they had this idea of professional networks and the fact that as the world was becoming more globalized, as borders were becoming more porous in the digital world, there was this opportunity for professionals to connect with each other, and like your network is critically important and it's about who you know and who they can help connect you with. And there was a value in the connectivity of networks in a professional context. They then wrote down about 20 different ways that one could monetize a professional network once it had scale, and it had benefited from a series of network effects. And today, we've still only scratched the surface on some of the ways to deliver value to members, to deliver value to customers, and ultimately to generate revenue for LinkedIn as well. And so I think they had pretty good clarity on the potential. if you start with a mission of connecting the world's professionals to make them be more productive and more successful, there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of billions of professionals around the world. So they had that foresight to know what was possible. They had the foresight to know the business opportunities, but as with any business, you figure out as you go to determine like what the path is from A to B.
Yeah. And so what do you think were some of the key decisions that led to the transition from what LinkedIn was to what it is now?
I think having a very clearly defined culture and values, it's like who we are and who we aspire to be and the principles that guide us. And the number one value at LinkedIn is members first. It is, and I think that is the value that has kept us grounded over the last decade plus. I think it is the value that ensures the platform remains a safe, trusted place for professional conversations. And it has meant, in my opinion, that we always have a sort of guiding or true north when we're taking business decisions. I think if your primary lens is this in the best interests of our members, and all of our customers are members, and 800 plus million members around the world, is this in the best interest of the members? If you keep that as your true north, I think it leads to making sensible decisions and stops you doing things that are detrimental to the network. So I'd say members first, like first and foremost. And then like from a cultural perspective and from values perspective, and notably from a culture, like making sure that you hire people that are both aligned with and can add to the culture. And actually that was one of the mistakes we made, which was for many years, we spoke about this notion of cultural fit when we were hiring people. And you hear it thrown about today often. We want to find people that are great cultural fit for LinkedIn. And what that ends up meaning is that you hire a load of people that look and feel exactly like the folks that you have in the business today. And diversity at LinkedIn in the first few years was not great. And I think arguably our business suffered as a result. And as we sort of started to grow up a little and we recognized the value and the importance of a diverse team bringing sort of new ideas, new opinions, new ways of working to LinkedIn, our business really started to, it was already working well, but it started to thrive. And now we think rather than a cultural fit, like a cultural add, who can come in, who's aligned with our values, like our values are not rocket science, who's aligned with the values but can add to our culture. It's been a really important shift that we made over the last few years.
That's great. That's great. In terms of active efforts to get more people onto the platform, I've seen, I think it was last year, you started hiring a creator management team. And I've spoken to a few of the creator managers, they're great. And then we've had new features pop up, whether it's, you know, the frames for profile pictures so people can have a video, pronunciation of people's names, adding pronouns, featured section, a ton of different features brought in by LinkedIn, all fairly recently, like the last few years. What else is happening to encourage people to post on the platform, to be active on the platform?
We've encouraged people to post for many years, as you know, like we've had a feed, I think, for the last 9 years. So ever since the advent of the feed on LinkedIn, we've always encouraged people to post professionally relevant, engaging content. Over the last couple of years specifically, and notably over the last 12, 18 months, we've made significant investments into the creator community. And a creator for us is anybody on LinkedIn that regularly shares engaging, relevant, professional content. And there's a couple of recommendations that we have for creators specifically. First and foremost, just you can shift the mode on LinkedIn to creator mode that gives you a slightly different look and feel to your profile. Second, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here. I think like sort of king creator sitting next to me. This is what you do for a living. So you've probably got far better advice than I do, but change to creator mode, publish at least 4 times a week. think about the breadth of content, but don't be too generic. So for example, if you're going to talk about management, don't talk about management in generic terms. Try and go to specific subtopics within management. So talk about performance management and then sort of use the hashtag performance management versus hashtag management. Yeah. Tag people that you think may be interested in participating in the conversation. Respond quickly to people who are commenting and posting on it. Experiment with different formats, experiment with different topics, follow other people on LinkedIn that are doing this really well. If you look at people like Helen Tupper or Sarah Ellis, they're talking about coaching and career performance. If you look at, there's a brilliant student on LinkedIn called Carissa Tan, student, young professional, advising people on the journey that she's going on, to the likes of Indra Nooyi, the ex-CEO of PepsiCo, who I think now is actually on the board of Amazon as well, talking about leadership and the lessons she's learned throughout her career. So there's when we talk about creators, I think often there's a perception of what a creator is. And a creator can be somebody of any age, anywhere around the world. They just have to have an opinion. They have to have something to share. It could be an individual. It could be a company. It could be a publisher. But it's definitely something that we have invested heavily in from a feature and functionality perspective, as well as creating communities of creators and hiring creator managers as well.
And following on from that, who are some of your favorite creators?
I think probably some of the folks that I've just mentioned. Like if you, Indra Nooyi is brilliant, absolutely. Like she's had a fascinating career. Is always wonderfully candid, constructive, helpful for anybody looking to get into business, and especially for people looking to get into leadership. Follow Bill Gates for some of the best tech on the planet. The folks that I mentioned earlier, sort of Sarah Ellis and Helen Tupper, both. They wrote a book on coaching and careers, which I found really fascinating. And I think they're probably some of the main ones that come to mind. Of course, I follow you as well.
It's really interesting because I've definitely noticed a transition in the kind of content that's on the platform.
Yeah.
It's become much more personal. People share their vulnerabilities and they link it back to work, but it just cuts through a lot of the kind of more corporate-esque content that I used to see more of on the platform. Even now we've got Mr. Beast, who's a huge YouTuber. We've got Vladimir Klitschko. We've got Jacinda Ardern. It feels like LinkedIn is now open to everyone, regardless of industry.
Without a doubt. In the early days of LinkedIn, it was financial services professionals, technology professionals. If you look in the UK today, actually the largest organization or largest company on LinkedIn is the NHS. So the breadth of professions, there are brilliant people on LinkedIn talking about medicine and nursing every day. Like if you look at the breadth of professions, that has changed dramatically over the last decade. I would argue LinkedIn is a much more inclusive place, a place where people have a much greater sense of belonging today than perhaps they did 5 or 10 years ago. And coming back to your comment about authenticity, I think that's what cuts through, and even more so over the last couple of years during COVID, where our professional lives and our personal lives started blurring more, and people started to recognize that if they were still within a professional lens, but if they were more authentic on LinkedIn and they shared their vulnerabilities more, that built followership, it built resonance with others. And in my opinion, it gives you other people to look at and think, they're going through something similar to me. Everyone's not living in this sort of perfect world. We all have our own insecurities. We all have our own anxieties. We all have stresses at work. We all have stresses at home. And I think it's important for people to be honest about that. And I'm not sure that historically they have been.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's so nice to see content, for example, from a really successful business person where they just acknowledge that just sometimes it's really shit.
Yeah.
And I remember I was in Pret once and I was not having a great day and wasn't having a great week. And I saw a few posts from that type of person. And I felt like they were direct messaging me that.
Yeah.
And it's so nice. There's a real community that forms as a result, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. And look, when I can't remember the year our publishing platform started. It must have been in 2000, and in fact, you may know better than I do, but I think it was about 2014, 2015. And I remember the first post that I wrote was an article called "Why Coming Out is Good for Business." And I was like unbelievably anxious about writing it. And the title was stolen from a wonderful book by Lord John Brown, the ex-CEO of BP. And I remember actually hovering at the time, like with my finger over the publish or the keyboard. And I was chatting to my HR partner at the time, and she came over and like pushed my hand out. And she was like, it's time to do this. And what struck me, and a lot of the commentary was about the struggles coming out and a lot of the anxieties and pressures and sort of panic attacks that came with that, and a lot of the benefits that I experienced as a result of that process, specifically within the workplace. But what struck me about that was the number of people that pinged me after I did it, privately pinged me to say how appreciative they were and how that was also their experience, but they'd never actually seen anyone in business talking about it. And for me, you know, from like 2010, 2011, I'm a bit of an open book. And prior to that, certainly wasn't the case. But that was my aha moment where I was like, okay, like vulnerability is actually a key strength in business. Whereas traditionally, I think vulnerability has been seen as a weakness.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember one of the first long form pieces of content I produced and uploaded to LinkedIn was called "The Lonely Reality of Being a 21-Year-Old Entrepreneur."
Yeah.
And it was just me whinging, having a proper whinge about having to dash around London the whole time, not, making much money, not having much motivation, having no one around me who really got it, having to work on my own, all of that kind of thing. And it got such a great response. So many people who had been there, so many people who were there currently were all kind of throwing in support. And one person commented, complete stranger, basically saying, hey, it's no different when you're 42.
Yeah.
Let's grab a drink. And that person, a guy called David Goldberg, ended up becoming a really good mentor to me.
Yeah.
And he would help me with business, teach me some really good learnings, and I would help him in turn with kind of building his personal brand and just giving him some advice.
Yeah.
And then, I think a couple of months later, he said, I've got a friend who I think you'd really get on with. There may even be an opportunity for you to work together that can introduce you. And at that time, I was like taking any introductions. I was like, of course, introduce me to whoever. Who is it? And he turned around and he said, it's a guy called James Caan from Dragon's Den. And I was like, oh my God, huge. And then through that introduction, which came through a post about me being vulnerable on LinkedIn and sharing my journey, that ended up with me working with James Caan. And now we're still working together 3 or so years later. And that all came from one piece of vulnerability and just saying it how it is, which I think is really special.
Yeah, I agree. It's a wonderful story, and I love the benefit of LinkedIn in that capacity, and the fact that it helped generate business for you and improved your network. That sense of belonging, though, whether it's to an entrepreneur community, whether it's an underrepresented group, whether it's sort of somebody with a similar gender or sexuality, ethnicity, whatever it may be, like that sense of belonging is so important in our personal lives and our professional lives. In fact, I think it's our brains are hardwired to belong. It's the same neural networks that look after primary needs such as food and water as social needs, and a load of research that shows a sense of belonging, sense of connectivity to people is a more powerful motivator than money. And I think for years we thought that money was the most powerful motivator for people in business, but actually from all the research, it's a sense of belonging, and that's something we strive to do on LinkedIn and in LinkedIn at the same time. So
I read the article that you mentioned, and I think you said you came out to your family and friends just after your 22nd birthday.
Yeah.
And then you went into work on the Monday and went straight back in the closet.
Yeah.
I would love to hear what that experience was like, and also if you had at the time any professional gay role models, because from what I've seen of you and the content you share, it looks like it's a case of being the person you wish you had when you were younger.
Answer to your question about professional gay role models, the answer was certainly no. Like, I grew up in the 80s in the UK, and like the headlines were horrendous. I mean, the headlines, they were outing politicians, they were outing actors, actresses. The headlines were always around like the gay plague, sort of referring to HIV and AIDS. And you therefore grow up in an environment where you assume that being gay is wrong. Certainly wasn't out at school, certainly wasn't out to my family. And you just assume it's wrong. And it took many years of like intense discomfort to get to a stage where I was comfortable coming out to my family and my friends. And I was very, very fortunate that they were incredibly thoughtful and caring and loving. But as you said, like that Monday morning, I went back into the work, and I think it's about 3/4 of grads do exactly the same. They go straight back into the closet. And that was based on not being entirely comfortable with myself. I dropped out of university. I was the youngest person at work, and I was gay. And I felt like all three of them put me at a disadvantage. And I thought if I would come out as gay, that it would be seen as a weakness, and that my career would be impacted. That's ultimately what it came to. I thought, and I was, in hindsight, and it was the only job that I've ever had where I experienced direct homophobia, and I wasn't out at the time. Wow. So I was like particularly anxious as a result of the incident that took place. But it took me changing jobs to have the confidence to come out. And then there was like all of these benefits I just didn't expect. My confidence built. I built more trusting relationships with colleagues, with clients, with partners. I think, it's for others to judge, but I think I became a more empathetic leader, or a more compassionate leader, perhaps, just because of the process of self-reflection that the journey that I'd been on. And I became more successful at that point. And most people, it just made work a hell of a lot more fun. Like, you want to go into work every day and you want to enjoy it. Like, we spend 45 years of our life working or something, and you want to go into work and like enjoy it every day. And I think although I benefited from work and I learned a load of skills before coming out in the workplace, I only started enjoying it once I was out.
That's really nice to hear. And so now you work at LinkedIn and you're in a position where you can make real change. Yeah. What are some of the steps that LinkedIn have taken in that respect?
Specifically with regards to sexuality?
Yeah.
So I'm very fortunate at LinkedIn. I'm the sort of exec sponsor of our employee resource group called Outed In. Everything has to have an in it somewhere. So yes. Outed In, which is for our LGBT plus employees around the world. And we have a community, I think now, of about 1,000 employees, either LGBT plus or allies who are participants in that community. We have done brilliant partnerships with our editorial team to ensure that we are regularly interviewing and publishing content from LGBT plus creators around the world and LGBT plus business leaders. We of course, we've ensured that all of our policies internally are equally applicable for same-sex partners as they are for men and women. We do fun things like celebrate in Pride every year. We work with a series of organizations to ensure increased LGBT equality when it comes to legislation around the world. Microsoft do that as well. There are so many ways that we try and ensure that everyone has a sense of, coming back to that idea of belonging, has a sense of belonging at LinkedIn. And I'm like, it's been an amazing journey to go on with that team over the last few years. That's brilliant. That must feel so special and authentic for you, having had the experience of being in the closet at work and then being out and now being in a place where it's so outwardly
kind of accepting and open for everyone?
Yeah, look, it's clearly very personal and therefore fulfilling. And don't get me wrong, there are still employees who come to LinkedIn that don't feel comfortable coming out. And I think and part of that is us and part of that could be them. Our role is to create an environment where people, if they choose to do so, and some people may not for very valid reasons, but if they choose to do so, feel comfortable, like bring their authentic self into work every day, whatever that may be. And we never want to prompt them. Like we just want to create a space where if they feel comfortable doing that, they can.
Brilliant. So we've got a new segment.
Yeah.
I asked the people of LinkedIn, of course, to send some questions in because you're coming onto the show. And so I'm going to read through a couple of them and would love to hear your answer. So the first is, what do you make of comments that say LinkedIn is turning into Facebook?
I think context is incredibly important, and we have always operated in a professional context. People are incredibly thoughtful about what they publish on LinkedIn because they know it reflects their professional identity, that their boss, that their colleagues, that their clients are going to see it. And it's something that we've always prided ourselves on over the last decade. It is a safe, trusted, and professional environment. And I very much hope that it stays that way for the next decade.
Brilliant. And another question says, why don't they invest in making chat in LinkedIn better?
I saw that question come through yesterday, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. Is it Fareed, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, Fareed. So Fareed, if you're listening, it's something that we have invested in very heavily over the last few years. But if you have suggestions of what we can do to improve it, please send me a note. I would love to see it, and I will commit to sharing that with our product team as well.
Brilliant. The next question, is being shadow banned a real thing?
Shadow banned?
Shadow banned when your content, the algorithm works against you actively based on something you posted in the past?
No.
Didn't think so.
It's not a real thing. We want to make sure that if you post content, that it gets the right engagement based on like how interesting, how relevant it is for people in your network. But no, that is not a thing. I've been reading a series of articles about it, but it's not accurate in any shape or form.
Okay, great. Good to know. The next question is LinkedIn planning on doing anything to combat spam and automation, particularly in messages and in inboxes?
It's not only something that we plan to do more about, but we have historically done a lot about it as well. And we have both automated as well as manual defenses to ensure that only relevant, trusted content surfaces in the feed or surfaces in somebody's inbox. And we're very transparent. There's a transparency report that we publish either once or twice a year that shows, I think it's like 98 to 99% of this content never actually sees the light of day. And so the content that we're talking about is a very, very small percentage of the billions of updates that flow through LinkedIn on a weekly and monthly basis. One thing I would encourage people to do, though, is if there is any content that they feel is inappropriate, either in their feed or in their inbox, please flag it. In the feed, you can just go to the three dots to the ellipsis on the feed. You can flag it as inappropriate. We'll immediately investigate, take action. Likewise in your inbox as well. That is one of the ways that our systems, our algorithms learn about what is appropriate, what isn't, who is posting and who isn't posting inappropriate content. So combination of manual defenses plus automated defenses. And also we rely on our audience to check that for us and submit anything to us that they don't feel comfortable with.
Okay, brilliant. And then a final question for this segment. How do you see LinkedIn changing now that more and more people are using the platform as a huge personal branding hub?
I'm going to throw that question back at you. How do you see LinkedIn changing and evolving?
I mean, I think that so much has already been done, some of the updates and platform tweaks that you mentioned earlier, but it really is the space to build your professional brand. Before LinkedIn, there was nothing. You know, if you posted a career win on Facebook, you know, people may like it, but they'd also roll their eyes and think, why are they sharing that?
Yeah.
Why are they bragging? And the same goes for Instagram and YouTube. There was never really a home for it. And now all of a sudden we have the rise of the business influencer.
Yeah.
And then also the rise of, as you said, we have interns building their personal brands.
Yeah.
We have people from every walk of life, every industry building their personal brand. My view is that it will absolutely continue.
Yeah.
And by the looks of it, you guys at LinkedIn are doing all of the kind of the hard work behind the scenes in investing to make sure that creators have all the tools, they have the infrastructure, so that this space can continue to grow in a way that's still meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair, and perhaps a slightly controversial place to say it. I'm not sure I like the phrase personal brand, because I think people misconstrue it. Mm-hmm. I think people interpret personal brand as, how do I show off about myself in a public space? And that is very quickly seen as self-serving. Mm-hmm. And actually the value when it comes to personal brand, like if your starting point is not you, if your starting point is the audience, if your starting point is what is the knowledge that I have, what's the expertise that I have that I can share with others that is going to deliver value for someone else who follows me, for somebody else in my network, that should be the starting point. Like if that's the starting point, and then that reflects well on the individual, brilliant. And that certainly helps advance that person's personal brand. Yeah. But I think some people have this sort of balance or ratio the wrong way round. And their starting point is like, what do I want to be known for? How can I get more of the spotlight on me? And I think that should be the byproduct of creating value for others. And the people who create value for others, the spotlight comes back on them and they benefit from it. But I sort of sometimes think people like either misunderstand, misconstrue the concept of personal brand, and it becomes, I don't know, it sort of sticks in the back of my throat occasionally when I hear the phrase thrown around.
That's really interesting. It's a great take. I don't think it's controversial, don't worry. But for me, personal branding is all around scaling your authentic self offline, but doing so online.
Yeah.
Essentially. So you build up your reputation from doing good work and from being genuine and being kind and respectful to people in every meeting, in every event that you go to and so on. I think LinkedIn gives the opportunity to do that on a much wider kind of stage, really. Yeah. You can put content out into the world that reflects yourself and your values and the things that you really care about. And then more and more people can see that and almost gravitate towards you. And I think that's really, really special.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like the idea of kind and respectful. I'd add helpful. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you help others in your network? That's ultimately what LinkedIn is about. Like, there's three primary reasons why people come to LinkedIn. They come to build their professional network, they come to find a job, and they come to stay informed or be better at the job that they're doing today. And when it comes to building your network, you don't always want to be the person asking. Mm-hmm. You can ask, certainly, and there's always like reasons and opportunities to ask people for help, and people should do that. But you should also think about, what's the value I can add to the network? What's the value that I can add to the community around me?
Yeah. I want to ask you so many more questions, but we're stuck for time.
Sure.
So the final thing I'd like to touch on is legacy and leaving a positive mark on the world. So the podcast is called Stamp Your Mark.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear your view. What is the positive mark that you'd like to leave on the world?
That is a big question.
It's a big question.
That is a big question. I think first and foremost, you want to be First and foremost, you want to be a great family member. You want to be a great husband, you want to be a great son, you want to be a great cousin, a great brother. Like, for me, that is the core. If you then sort of move beyond the core, the question is, have you lived an authentic life that has helped create value and support those around you? Have you stood up for people? Have you done everything you can to support the communities around you? And as a result of your actions, are people better off? And if there's a couple of people better off in the world as a result of me coming into it, for me, that's success.
It's a big question, but that's a great answer. Lovely answer. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Appreciate the invite.